In this video, I'll be showing how I made blast gates for my new dust extraction system. I'm going to be putting out 3 videos about the new system. This first one is about the blast gates, the second one will be about my cyclone dust separator, and the third one is going to cover the extractors that I'm going to be using, the ducting, how I connected up all of my machines, and installing a pillar to my workshop from which to run not only dust collection but also power and compressed air. Before I get started, in case you don't know what a blast gate is or what it's used for, it's quite simply a way of being able to control where you want your extractor to extract from. So for example, if I want my extractor to suck from my table saw, I can turn that blast gate on and make sure all the others are off, and that way I'll get really good suction and airflow right from the tool where I need it. To make my blast gates, I'm going to be using some offcuts of 12mm MDF. I chose MDF mainly because it's what I had, but in the past I've used plywood to make similar gates and they were just as effective. In fact, plywood is actually better in some ways, and I'll talk about that in more detail a little bit later on in the project. I started by cutting some squares of the MDF at the table saw, and then I ripped some thin strips of the MDF. These strips got glued and pinned to the square, flush to 2 opposing edges. You could just use glue and clamps here, but I'm using brad nails just to speed things up so that I can carry on working. I then added glue and added another of the square pieces on top, again making sure to keep all of the edges nice and flush. Next, at the miter saw, I trimmed away the excess to get the edges flush. I can then measure the internal width of the opening. So I cut some more MDF pieces to about 1 or 2mm less than that measurement to make sure they would fit nicely inside the opening, with a tiny amount of play so that they would slide in and out without getting snagged. Then I trimmed those pieces to length at the miter saw. So now I have something that works like this, but I want to add some stops to this sliding piece, so I glued and pinned a couple of strips at each end. I then marked up the centre of the square by drawing a cross by positioning the ruler from corner to corner. I then made sure that the sliding piece was pushed all the way to one side, and then I drilled a pilot hole at the centre point using the pillar drill. I'm using a 5mm drill bit here, but the size of the bit doesn't really matter, and I drilled all the way through all 3 layers of MDF. I bought a 68mm hole saw bit from Amazon. This one is by Bosch. This is the same size as the ducting pipe that I'm going to be using for my dust extraction system. I'll link to this in the description box below if you're interested. Now, this hole saw bit works great on solid wood and plywood, but it doesn't do too well with MDF, and that's why I actually regret choosing MDF for this application, and I wish I'd used plywood. I set my pillar drill to its lowest speed setting by moving the belt as per the instructions on the lid. So the problem I had was that the teeth on the hole saw bit just repeatedly got clogged up with MDF dust, even though I kept lifting the bit while drilling to try and clear the dust away. It definitely helps to have the pillar drill set to its lowest speed, but it was still a really slow process drilling through the MDF. I drilled through both sides to make sure I got a nice clean hole. Occasionally the MDF dust getting caught in the teeth would actually stall the pillar drill motor, which was really annoying. But anyway, eventually I managed to get the holes in all of my blast gates drilled all the way through. I decided to paint the inside of my blast gates green to represent their on position. So here I'm masking off the areas where I don't want to get any paint, and then I can spray the inside. I was careful here to only add a very thin layer of paint because I don't want the thickness of the paint to interfere with how the gates open and close. I also wrote on and off markings with a marker pen just so I can easily see at a glance which gates are on and which are off. I cleaned up the edges of the gates with a block plane followed by a bit of sanding. To add the PVC pipes to the blast gates, I make sure that they're switched to the off position, and then I add the length of pipe that I needed, butting the end of the pipe right up to the internal sliding part of the gate. And I added a bead of hot glue around the perimeter. When I made similar blast gates in the past, I actually used silicone for this, and over time a few of them failed, but using hot glue works great and gives much more hold, which makes them really solid. I added pipe to both sides of the blast gates, and now they're ready to install to my new dust extraction system, which I'll be showing in more detail in another video. As soon as that video is available, you'll find a link to it in the description box below. So you might be wondering why I decided to make my blast gates rather than buy them. Basically, all the ones I've seen that are available to buy are very loose fitting. They don't seal well, which means that air can leak out, which means that the airflow is going to be less efficient, and that compromises suction. The blast gates I made seal really well, so there are no leaks whatsoever. Also, for the diameter of pipe that I'm using in my system, these blast gates are obviously a perfect fit because they are connected directly to the same size pipe that I'm using for all of my ductwork. You can buy blast gates that are 63mm, which might be a good fit for the internal diameter of the pipes that I'm using anyway, but I'm not sure as I don't have one of those to try it out. The 68mm PVC downpipe that I'm using for my system is designed for guttering applications, and I'll go into more detail about the good reasons and the bad reasons for using it as ducting in the main video about my dust extraction system. I hope you enjoyed this video. Please subscribe for more weekly woodworking videos. If you'd like to get early access to my videos, exclusive content, free project plans and cut lists, and a name credit at the end of my videos, you can support the channel via Patreon, and there's a link to that page in the description box below. Thanks for watching.